Well, we've been talking about Hamlet, and the last several hours, as a matter of fact, of class time, we've been talking about Hamlet, and we're going to wind up that discussion today and then move on to discuss John Donne's poetry as our principal example of what in the early 17th century was called metaphysical poetry. And we'll talk about what that mysterious term may mean. But let's go back to Shakespeare for just a couple of minutes. You will recall that at the end of our last class, I was saying, well, look at that final scene. Look at the last scene in which we have Hamlet now being set up for the sword fighting contest with Laertes. And Laertes is in cahoots with Claudius, the king, to do away with Hamlet. He not only is going to use a sword from which he has removed the point, removed the tip, so that his sword actually has a sharp point to it, and therefore is a lethal weapon, whereas Hamlet presumably does not have a lethal weapon. And the other thing is that Laertes says he's going to put poison on the tip of his sword. So this is fully consistent with the revenge play in Renaissance drama, something that was known as the revenge play, or more properly, the revenge tragedy, because as in the case of Hamlet, these revenge plays often ended, as a matter of fact, probably usually ended in tragedy. Nevertheless, the play was motivated in very large part by revenge. And here, of course, we have double revenge. In two cases, Hamlet's and Laertes, the motive being to avenge the killing of one's father by the son. That is to say, the avenger would be the son. Okay, so in that final scene, in Olivier's production, there's something very interesting. Remember that Claudius is going to leave nothing to chance. And so he adds a jewel to the cup of wine from which he's going to invite Hamlet to drink. And that jewel has been covered with some kind of poison as well. So, as the scene progresses, Hamlet says no after the first round of sword fighting, in which he gets a hit on his opponent. And a hit in fencing, as you probably know, is where you score the point, and you win at least that round, if not the entire match. And so what happens here is that Claudius offers the wine to Hamlet. Hamlet says, no, not yet. I'll wait a little while before I have some of the wine. And presumably he doesn't want it to go to his head because, sword fighting is a game of, or a sport of extreme skill in which reflexes are everything. Absolutely everything. So, Claudius sets the cup with the poisoned jewel down on a table. And we see the queen looking at it, and then she looks back at the sword fighting. She looks at it again, and so forth. And it's very clear that in Olivier's direction of that scene, that he is having us believe that Queen Gertrude knows that it's poisoned, and so she takes the cup. Claudius tries to stop her, and she says, "No, sir, I will." And she drinks it down with a fond look toward her son. Well, that is clearly Olivier's interpretation of that scene, or that part of that scene, because there's nothing in the text of the play that would indicate that she knows that she's drinking poisoned wine in order to save her son's life. And you won't find that in other productions, at least not the productions that I know of, unless there is a production out there that has followed Olivier's interpretation that I haven't seen. So, that's part of what I've been talking about. How when we look at Hamlet, we're talking about the production of a play. We're not simply talking about a script for a production. What you have in your book is a text, a script for a play. But that play is only fully realized in performance. And every performance is going to involve an interpretation of the play, its various characters, their relationships, and the various parts of the play in relation to one another. So that's the project that I am setting up for you. And I think that it should be clear enough now what I'm asking you to do in terms of not only analyzing somebody else's production of the play, but also indulging me in telling me how you would produce a particular part of that play. Okay, are there any questions now about anything that I've said? Has anybody had a chance to look at a production over the last couple of days? So, anybody want to offer any ideas about how that was handled? Yeah.
I saw Olivier's, and
Okay.
I was kind of disagreeing with about half of the interpretation as I was watching it.
Like what? I mean, just give us one example, say.
Well, the last scene that you were just talking about, because I didn't. Part of it was I didn't see it in the text that she knew, but and I didn't think that there was any context for it. Mm-hmm. But I didn't get where he got that interpretation. It seems like he added things like that in a lot. Yeah, that's true. That's true. Whether he's justified in doing so or not, that's another question. That's another question. Okay, anybody else? Any other suggestions, ideas? Yeah.
I watched bits of, I watched all of Zeffirelli's and Kenneth Branagh's, and I thought that Zeffirelli I don't know what he was doing, but I didn't feel like any relationships that were in there, and so I don't know if anyone's seen him, but it felt like they're trying to interpret it as him being mad from the beginning, because he was really paranoid the whole time, even before he saw his father, the ghost, so I wasn't.
You mean in the Zeffirelli production? Yeah. And for those of you who are a little hazy about which one that is, that's the one with Mel Gibson playing Hamlet and Glenn Close playing Gertrude, and so on and so on. Okay. Well, that's interesting. The opening scene, by the way, takes place where? Do you remember? Where's the opening scene?
In Zeffirelli's, they were at the funeral of his father.
Okay, of the old Hamlet, who has now died. Okay. Where do you find that burial scene in the play, in the text of the play? You don't. You don't. That whole scene was made up by Zeffirelli. And he takes a speech from later on in the play and he imports it into that invented scene. Okay? And much of that scene, of course, takes place without any lines. It's done in a totally visual, nonverbal way. But we do have some speaking, and that speaking, as I said, comes from later on in the play. So that's the kind of license that a director will sometimes take in producing a particular version of a play. And the same thing is true with other plays. I mean, here we're taking a classic Shakespearean play, but we could be taking a modern play. Or you could be taking something like opera. Or think of what filmmakers do when they take the text of a novel and turn the text of a novel into a play, in effect, for filming. You know, there's been, within the last few years, a whole series of films, some of which are very good, by the way, based on Jane Austen's novels. Well, once again, read the novels and, if you wish, see the films. The novels are wonderful, of course, and see the films and see what you think. See what you think about what the director and the actors and the other creative people have done with the interpretation of the novel. And what I've just said applies even more so to the script of a play, in which we usually have much less descriptive apparatus in the script. You have mainly just the lines of the actors, and you don't have all the other stuff that you have in many novels, such as the descriptions of the scenes, at least not at the same kind of length, who was where, what kind of chair they're sitting on, what they're wearing, what they're thinking, and so forth. So, okay, there is a very important form of literary and dramatic criticism, which is called performance theory and performance criticism. Now, we've had performance theory and performance criticism around for a very, very long time. But in recent years, and I'm talking about within the last couple of decades, there's been a resurgence of interest in this, and particularly in what makes something theatrical. And if you look at the play, you'll notice that in one sense the play is very largely about plays and about theatricality and about the playing of plays. Look at the play within the play is the most obvious example of that. Or look at Hamlet when he claims at the end of Act 1 that he's going to be playing a part, right? He's not really going to be mad. He's going to put antic disposition on. So he's playing a part. Look at Claudius. Claudius is playing a part, isn't he? Polonius at times is playing a part. Would we say the same kind of thing about Ophelia? Maybe yes, maybe no. It would be an interesting discussion. So notice that in one sense, we can talk about performance, playing parts, theatricality in a discussion of the play itself. Then secondly, we can talk about how the play would actually be performed as produced. And we could do that looking at different times in history, couldn't we? Scholars have gone back and have been able to reconstruct many of the conditions for performance and production of plays in Shakespeare's time. We know a lot about some of the great theaters, particularly the Globe, which, after it was constructed, became the principal place in which Shakespeare's company presented its plays. And we know a lot about the physical staging of the action in theaters like the Globe. It was almost theater in the round. The audience sat on three sides of the stage. And there would be the people who paid the least, who were known as the groundlings, who would stand. They didn't have seating on the ground level. But then there were galleries in which there were seats. And that's where people would sit who could pay a little bit more money. And there were also other kinds of things that would go on during the performance, or perhaps between some of the different sections of the play, when there might be changes of stage scenery or that sort of thing, though there wasn't elaborate stage scenery in our sense of elaborate stage scenery in the Renaissance stage. And there were orange girls, as they were called, who would circulate among the crowd, and they would sell oranges and other fruits. And apparently in some plays there were pickpockets, so that you had to be a little careful about whom you were standing next to or who might bump into you. There at least were rumors at times that there were prostitutes who were looking for customers among members of the audience. And that's one of the reasons why The Puritans, a little bit later on when they came to power, at a time which we'll be talking about probably beginning tomorrow in our next segment, the Puritans had the theaters closed because they saw them as sites of immorality. Plays themselves were immoral, but the theater was also a site of immoral behavior, they believed. And so we'll talk about that in the closing of the theaters in 1642. And the theaters were not reopened for another 18 years. So when the Puritan Commonwealth government eventually collapsed and there was a restoration of the monarchy in 1660. But we'll talk about that a little bit later on. Okay, so in Shakespeare's case, once again, we know a good deal about how plays were produced, how actors performed. They could fit quite a large audience into the theater. And so people in general could see the action, but notice that then it becomes an acoustical problem. How do people hear all of the lines? Well, in part, because of the way in which the theaters were designed, the acoustics were generally quite good. But also, the actors would have to project their voices. They would have to project their voices. And it's not easy to have subtle nuances if you're projecting your voice to make it loud enough to be heard in the highest balcony or the farthest back among the so-called groundlings. So, the subtlety of nuance could get lost that we would find in a more intimate modern theatrical setting, or on film, where I don't know if any of you have ever been present at filming, but with filming, when people are doing close-ups, the camera is usually 2 or 3 feet, maybe 4 feet at the most, away from the person who is acting. And that's why you can catch all of the slightest nuances of facial movement and gesture and so forth. Well, that kind of thing would have been impossible on the Elizabethan stage. Another way of performing, in part an effort to compensate in the presentation of certain kinds of feelings, is that scholars have discovered certain elocutionary and dramatic elocutionary manuals which have diagrams in them, that if the speaker is conveying one emotion, the speaker may stand in a certain way and gesture in a certain way. If the speaker is conveying a different emotion, then a different kind of stance and gesture would be called for. And this is a kind of coding, theatrical coding of emotions according to physical gestures. And these physical gestures, of course, could be observed by people throughout the theater. So it's interesting going back into Shakespeare's own time and talking about the conditions of performance and production. We can also do this in subsequent centuries down to our own. For example, how was Shakespeare produced in the 18th century, or in the 19th century, or in the 20th century, and so forth? What kinds of technologies for theatrical production were available at these different times, and how were they used? And I just mentioned one a moment ago, that with modern cinematography, we have a technology which makes possible a production of a Shakespeare play that would not have been possible in Shakespeare's own time, not even in a relatively intimate theater. And sometimes the players did have command performances in more intimate theatrical surroundings, either before the reigning monarch or the members of the aristocracy and perhaps some other wealthy people and the like. So we have actual records of those kinds of things. Also, in our own time, I've asked you to consider, in looking at least one production of Hamlet, what other kinds of choices have been made. And then to consider what choices you would make. You're the director now. You have been assigned the job of putting this play on. You're the one who's talking to the actors. You're the one who's talking to the costume designing people. You're the one who's talking to the people who are doing the sets. Okay? You're the one making these decisions. So what kinds of decisions would you make, and would they agree or not agree with the production or productions that you have viewed by one or more other directors? So, and if you differ, why do you differ? I mean, we don't just differ for the sake of differing. Why do you differ? So, see, it leads to a lot of interesting thinking about the play, because you have to conceive of what the play is really about, at least from your point of view. Now, there's no real way in which you can get this wrong, in the sense that if you have studied the play carefully, then the vision that you're going to bring to it is your vision. It's not going to be Olivier's vision. It's not going to be my vision. It's going to be your vision that you bring to the play. But it has to be an informed vision, one based on a careful study of the play and of its production. Okay? Any last questions about this? All right. Well, let's move right along then to a contemporary of Shakespeare's, John Donne, also one of our great poets. He was flourishing in the early part of the 17th century, and he would have been a little bit younger than Shakespeare, but not a whole lot. And what we associate with Donne and certain other poets of his time is particularly a movement in poetry that is called metaphysical poetry. Let me write this down here. Let me just write it on the tablet first. Metaphysical poetry. Now, probably everybody here is aware of what the word metaphysical means. What does the word metaphysical mean? Any ideas? What does the word metaphysical mean? Yeah.
Is it a metaphor used throughout, like, that wouldn't be seeming like it would fit, but somehow it makes it fit? I guess
that's not a bad start on a description of a metaphysical conceit as a form of poetry. But what does the term metaphysics mean, or metaphysical mean? Supernatural, okay. Something which is beyond the physical. Something which is beyond the physical. The Greek prefix meta means beyond. Means beyond. And the Greek word physis is the word that comes down to us as physics, physical, and so forth. It's the word for body, or the material. So something which is metaphysical is something which is spiritual, or something which is beyond the physical, supernatural perhaps. Okay? Now, don't get too bogged down in that here, because so-called metaphysical poetry is not metaphysical in the same way that we sometimes use that term in talking about metaphysical writings of contemporary spiritual masters and that sort of thing. Let's look at the metaphysical conceit. If we can go to the PowerPoint screen, please. Okay, remember what we said about a conceit? That a conceit is the bringing together in a kind of metaphorical combination two things which are in their ordinary sense or ordinary experience quite apart from one another and quite unlike one another. And so we have seen some of these things before, when the Elizabethan sonneteer would compare his mistress' eyes to the sun. Well, obviously, the woman's eyes are not suns, but here they are likened to suns. And so there's a kind of poetic simile taking place in which there's a new combination, a new what was called conceit. Or if hair be wires, well, hair is not really wiry. I mean, not literally. I mean, sometimes we say that somebody has wiry hair, but not literally, okay? Or lips like coral. Well, you know, once again, that's not literally true, but it is figuratively perhaps true. That the conceit is a kind of figure that brings together things that are, in our normal experience, unlike one another. Now, in these Elizabethan conceits, often derived from Petrarch, so that they're often called, therefore, Petrarchan conceits, especially for the lady, or in the mouth of the male poet, describing how beautiful she is, and therefore why he is so attracted to her. These conceits tended to become cliches. They tended to become cliches. So remember when Polonius is reading Hamlet's letter to Ophelia? It's filled with all of the worst cliches of that tradition of conceits for the lady. The metaphysical conceit is much more unusual, even to the point, some critics would say, of being strained or outrageous. And that's what Samuel Johnson said. He called the metaphysical conceit an example of discordia concors. Now that's a Latin phrase which probably should not be very difficult for non-Latin students to figure out. Concors means things that go together, things that get along. When we talk about concord, that's what we usually mean, right? But what about things that are discordant? Things that are discordant. Well, these are things that do not get along with one another. And Johnson said that what produced the metaphysical conceit is taking things that are extremely unlike one another and forcing them together in some new concord, as it were. And so he uses that famous phrase, which I put on the screen a moment ago, that they are marked by the fact that they are disparate images by violence yoked together. He didn't like metaphysical poetry, by the way. Samuel Johnson didn't. And he felt that it was a kind of violence being done to language, and that there was nothing particularly witty or beautiful about that. And that this was testing, as I have said, the limits of the Aristotelian, or more generally, classical analogy of being. The analogy of being in Aristotle's philosophy meant that there is some relationship among all of the different levels of being, despite their differences. Despite their differences. Remember the great chain of being? with God up at the top, and then the angels, and then humans, and so on and so on and so on. According to the Aristotelian concept of the analogy of being, there is something like and something unlike the beings who are placed at different positions on that great scale of being. That's what an analogy means, right? An analogy means bringing together two things which are in some ways alike and in some ways unlike. That's what an analogy means in logic. That's what analogical reasoning means. Now, in the case of the metaphysical conceit, then, notice that if you have human beings or aspects of human beings being compared to animals or being compared to non-animate objects, then what you're doing is you're testing the limits of comparability, aren't you? We're going to see an example of that, particularly in the poem A Valediction Forbidding Mourning. And I'll tell you what the point is now, but we'll look at the poem in more detail in just a moment. It's about a husband and wife, and the poet is a husband who is apparently forced by some kind of business to go away on a kind of business trip. And so he's very sad about leaving his wife, even for a short time, and she apparently is quite sad also, given how he's approaching this with her. And so he likens the two of them to the arms of a compass. Now, I'm not talking about a compass such as the one that you find magnetic north with, and therefore you find direction with. I'm talking about the kind of compass that you took to school. Remember your little box that you had to carry to school when you were in elementary school? And you'd have your pencils and erasers and your little ruler and so forth. Well, once you got to a certain age, you were permitted to bring a compass, and it would typically have a point that you would stick into your page, and then it would spread out and there would be a pencil. And so it would look something like this, right? And so the point would stay in a fixed position. That's why it was a sharp point. And then the pencil would go around it. And it would draw what? Circles, right? And if you spread out the arms of the compass, or legs of the compass, if you want to change the metaphor, you would have a larger circle, but it's still a circle, right? And you can draw them closer together, and you have a smaller circle. But whether the circle is large or small, the moving arm of the compass is always in the same fixed relation to the center, right? Okay, I mean, mathematically considered, right? Anybody disagree with that? Okay. And of course, we're talking about a circle, which from the time of the ancients onward has been regarded as the perfect figure. So, this becomes a conceit in John Donne's poetry for the relationship between the husband and the wife when the husband has to go away on a business trip. Now, talk about something unusual, to put it in most favorable terms, or as Samuel Johnson, a great 18th century writer and critic, by the way, as Samuel Johnson would have put it, that this was outrageous. This is an example of disparate images by violence yoked together. And we'll talk more about Johnson and his period a little bit later on. But in any event, that's what the metaphysical conceit is or does. We're going to see a number of examples in the next few minutes. Okay, so let's look at the first of the poems of John Donne's on the syllabus. That's the song, Go and Catch a Falling Star. Donne had a very interesting life and career. He was a member of the court, and apparently he was something of a womanizer, and he also married this young girl at a scandalously early age, and apparently under somewhat scandalous circumstances. And then after a while, however, he settled down. He underwent a religious conversion, and he even became an Anglican priest. And as we shall see a little bit later on, he wrote some of the most beautiful and profound religious poetry in the English language. But he also wrote these very light poems about sex and sexual relations and women and certain humorous views of women and relations between women and men and so forth. Most people, and I'm talking now about the scholars who deal with this period, most people usually therefore see different stages of development in Donne's career as both a person and as a poet. So, let's look first of all at the song, Go and Catch a Falling Star. Get with child a mandrake root. We'll come back to that in just a moment. Tell me where all past years are, or who cleft the devil's foot. Teach me to hear mermaids singing, or to keep off envy's stinging, and find what wind, which could have been then pronounced what wind, serves to advance an honest mind. Okay, what he's doing here is he's setting up a series of impossibilities, right? Do you remember when we were talking about the marriage group in the Canterbury Tales? And I was talking about the Franklin's Tale, which we don't have on our syllabus as one of the works that we're reading, but I was telling you the story of it. And there's a point at which the young wife, whose husband has gone away on the nightly wars, is approached by a young would-be lover, and she wants to get rid of him, but she also doesn't want to be terribly insulting. And so she says, okay, you make those terrible black rocks off the coastline go away. She's been afraid that her husband's boat might capsize on such rocks. You make those rocks go away, and yes, I will become your mistress. Well, what is she really saying to him? She's really saying to him something like I mentioned at the time. Okay, buddy, you know, if you can go and lift the Empire State Building, yes, then I will become your mistress. Giving the person a deliberately, but perhaps humorously, impossible task as a way of brushing the person off, but doing so in a more or less polite way. Okay? That's also what's happening here. Go and catch a falling star. Ever seen falling stars at night? So-called falling stars. They're not really falling stars, of course. But so-called falling stars. Well, of course that's impossible. Get with child a mandrake root. Well, your footnote points out, what this means. The mandrake root is shaped like the lower part of the human body. And so, how could you possibly make pregnant a mandrake root? Well, obviously you can't. Tell me where all past years are. Another impossibility. Or who cleft the devil's foot? Teach me to hear mermaids singing. See, one after another, after another, after another, impossible task. And find what wind or wind serves to advance an honest mind. Remember what I said about honest? When we were talking about Hamlet and Hamlet's use of the term honest, when he's approaching Ophelia and he says, art thou honest? Art thou honest? Art thou fair? that honest meant not only what we mean by honest, but it also means chaste in Shakespeare's and Donne's time. If thou beest born to strange sights, things invisible to see, ride 10,000 days and nights till age snow white hairs on thee, thou, when thou returnest, wilt tell me all strange wonders that befell thee, and swear nowhere lives a woman true and fair. True in the sense of faithful and fair. Okay? Fair also in both senses of the term fair. Okay? This is a witty little song in which he's, playing little games, apparently with the ladies. If thou findest one, that is to say, a woman who is both honest and fair, let me know. Such a pilgrimage were sweet. Yet do not. I would not go, though at next door we might meet. Though she were true when you met her, and last till you write your letter, yet she will be false ere I come to 2 or 3. Well, this is not intended to be a serious poem. This is one of those kinds of things that was done as a joke and would probably be either read aloud or passed around at the court or in courtly societies. And of course, it would provoke some laughter, but also lots of witty replies. And, there would be the women who would be, coming back with their own poems, attacking Donne's poem, or their own rejoinders, in public social situations. But it also does suggest to us certain kinds of gender attitudes, doesn't it? Oh, well, that's what we all know to be true of women. Who knows to be true of women? You see, these are cliches about women. And they're cliches about women that are designed not by women so much as they are by men. Now, I realize that with a little poem like this, a silly little poem like this, it would put an awful burden on it to try to erect a whole structure on this poem of gender attitudes towards men and women. But certainly we can see by implication some of these, can't we? Okay, so let's go to the next one I want to take up is The Flea, and then we'll come back to the canonization. The Flea. This is another witty little poem. And it's constructed in a perfectly logical way, almost like a syllogism. The Flea. He's talking to a lady, okay? This is not something that he's just speaking himself. Frequently enough, you can have a lyric poem in which we have the voice of a speaker, right? There's a kind of voice in the poem, but that voice is not necessarily addressing anybody in particular. But you can also have a dramatic monologue, what we call a dramatic monologue. Okay, let me go back to the tablet, please. And first, we get this off. Okay, now. A dramatic monologue. Okay, first of all, what's a monologue? Anybody know what a monologue is? What is a monologue?
Speaking alone or to someone else, but you the only one that speaks.
Yeah, right. A monologue means that there's only one person speaking, right? But now it's possible for one person to be speaking and there not being any implied dialogue. A dramatic monologue implies that it is not only to another person, but that person is responding. And you can infer the person's responses from what is said in the monologue. Okay? I'm going to show you how this works here. That also was revived as a very important poetic form in the latter part of the 19th century and then again in the early parts of the 20th century. Okay, the flea. Mark but this flea. He's speaking to somebody else. She's right there. And she's responding to him. And mark in this how little that which thou deniest me is. Okay? See, what he's really getting at here is a seduction. And he apparently has made some sexual advance or advances toward her, and she has rejected him. And so now what he's going to do is he's going to construct this very witty argument in which he's going to argue that her giving him her sexual favor is going to be of no greater consequence than the flea. Okay? So see the outrageous kind of comparison? The outrageous kind of comparison in this conceit? You know, as if love and sexuality could be equated with a flea and the life or the death of a flea. Well, that's an example of the metaphysical conceit. And that's the kind of thing that Samuel Johnson at least thought was a form of discordia concors, or a kind of violence done to poetic language. We'll continue this after our break.